After Aelred wrote The Mirror of Charity in about 1142, at Bernard's wish, Aelred, interestingly, didn't write anything for another 11 years.
Holy Queen, Mother of mercy, hail our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To you do we cry, for banished children of Eve. To you do we say.
When he did finally write, he did not continue doing a work of spiritual guidance or thought about the nature of the Cistercian order. Instead, he turned in a totally different direction and began to write what was the first of his works of history. And the first one, it seems to me, which is called Battle of the Standard, it seems to me almost characteristically the first work of a new author, somebody who's trying to do it, who hasn't actually figured out how to structure it, what he wants to say, what his argument is. I can say, having spent 40 years teaching freshman writing, that I recognize the work of someone who doesn't know how to write a paper in what Aelred does here. It's sort of a mishmash. It's a little of this, a little of that, and we have to ask questions like, why did he write this at all? What was his argument? Now, if we compare it to Mirror of Charity, which is very carefully laid out repeatedly, first book, second book, third book. In the first book, I'm doing this, in the second and the third. Well, that's the book for which Bernard had provided the structure. In Battle of the Standard, there is no clear structure. And scholars have spent time trying to come up with significant explanations for some of the oddness about it, but I think the significant explanation may be that he doesn't yet know how to organize a treatise. So I'll give you, first of all, a little bit of the historical context of this work. As I say, the title of it is The Battle of the Standard. I'll get to that in a minute. It refers to an 1138 battle in the north of England. But the context of that is that in 1135, King Henry I died. He left a single living child whom he had designated, not privately but publicly, as his heir, Matilda, who had at one point married the Emperor of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor. So she was always known as the Empress Matilda. I should tell you that in the 12th century, there were more Matildas around than you would imagine. So it's helpful that she's always the Empress Matilda. The Empress Matilda had been his designated heir, and he had required all the nobles in England to swear allegiance to her. So there was no question about who the heir was. When Henry died, rather abruptly, Matilda was living in France with her then husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, and heavily pregnant, and began to come to England to take the throne. But her cousin, Stephen of Blois, who was also in France but not pregnant, rushed to England and got there first and got the crown. For the next 19 years, Matilda and Stephen battled for the crown of England. Stephen had the crown and exercised it and was perhaps not a bad king, but he had to spend all those years fighting a war, which raged across England, and of course nobles sometimes changed positions. So there was always a question about which region was supporting each of the contenders. As Matilda's older son grew up, Henry, named for his grandfather, obviously, as he grew up, he joined the battle and helped to be fighting on behalf of his mother. Meanwhile, the Empress Matilda's uncle, King David of Scotland, who had, like everyone else, and like Stephen, by the way, had vowed loyalty to Matilda. Stephen clearly was not fighting on behalf of Matilda, but King David did fight on behalf of Matilda throughout this period. So, in 1138, there had been, after numerous battles across England, but also battles taking place in the north of England, perhaps on behalf of Matilda, but perhaps on behalf of Scotland itself, because there was an ongoing desire for land by the Scots. So the Scots would do incursions into England to try to grab a piece of northern England, and then they'd be beaten back, and they'd take some land, but they would lose others. In 1138, King David mounted one of these incursions into the north of England. Was it in support of Matilda? Well, he might have said so. Was it because he wanted land? Well, perhaps. There had been a recent battle not far away where he had won, and he obviously thought that this battle would give him a chance to pick up more land. So Aelred, who by this time has been a monk at Rievaulx for this 38, for 4 years, he's faced with a very interesting situation. First of all, the people who are fighting on behalf of Scotland are people he knows. I mean, probably all the nobles are people he knows, but especially King David, who had been, after all, his patron for 10 years of his youth. And Prince Henry, his close friend, the young man he had grown up with. These are the people battling on behalf of Scotland against England. Aelred is English, and however much he may have cared about that in general terms, he has by now been living in the north of England, not that far away from where this battle is taking place. Furthermore, the people who are leading the English forces are Thurston, Archbishop of York, who's actually not at the battle, but is calling people to arms. Walter Aspec, who's the patron of Rievaulx, plus other Englishmen he cares about. He has people that he cares deeply about on both sides. What's more, it's not only just the people, it's also the situation. He's in England and it's being attacked by the Scots, and the Scots do not have a good reputation among the English because they keep attacking, right? This is the historical context of this particular work. It raises some questions about why Aelred is writing it, and I will get to those later. But another of the questions is, this battle takes place in 1138. Does Aelred write this work in 1139, let's say, after it's over? No, he doesn't write it till 1153. This is a puzzling piece on all sorts of terms. The work also is puzzling because it doesn't actually tell us much about the battle. It's a work of speeches. It's a work of Walter Aspec calling to the English soldiers to fight on behalf of their king, King Stephen. And Aelred's language in the speech of Walter, is solidly in support of King Stephen, which is interesting because he changes sides later. We have speeches from old friends of David who are now trying to talk him out of doing this battle. We have speeches from the Galwegian forces who fight with David, who are clearly the villains in this work. Interestingly, although David and Henry are both pictured in this work, Aelred never calls them by name. Sort of as though if he just calls them the king and the prince, then maybe we will forget who they are, so he doesn't have to say bad things about them. So it's a work full of speeches. It has digressions into the founding of Rievaulx. David comes off as weak-willed, and so although he's not exactly a villain, he's also not a good figure. So this is the context for this really confusing work. I should say, by the way, that the Battle of the Standard, which had no consequences whatsoever, to some extent, well, the English won, which is to say that the Scots didn't take any land. But in fact, there were no consequences to this battle. But for some reason, it has come down through history. There are two contemporary chronicles that talk about it. It shows up in Ivanhoe. I recently read a novel that my sister sent me as a gift that has the Battle of the Standard prominently discussed in it. And I understand, you may not care about this, but I understand that in the English cigarette paper collection of great battles of England, the Battle of the Standard is one of the battles included in the Great Battles of England. If you collect cigarette papers from the Great Battles of England from the, let's say, 40s and 50s, you would have a paper of the Battle of the Standard. So that's the context. Now I'll tell you a little bit about the work itself. Aelred begins by talking about the beginning of the battle. He doesn't talk about what has gone before. He simply starts with the battle itself, with the beginning of the battle itself. He says, when King Stephen had occupied the southern districts, the king of the Scots assembled an immense army, not only of those subject to his rule, but also no small number from the Orkney Islands. There's a little bit of xenophobia that runs through this work. The Scottish forces included Scots, but they also included other groups from around Scotland. And there's a little bit of a sense in here that Aelred wants to call attention to this as not being pure-blooded Scots. Advancing with great pride and ferocity, he intended to subdue all the northern part of England or to depopulate it by fire and sword. There is no positive picture of the Scots going to war. The English respond, led by Walter a Spec and Archbishop Thurston, on behalf of King Stephen. Setting up the royal ensign that is commonly called the Standard in a broad field near Northallerton, the English decided to engage the enemy there. Thurston the Archbishop also published an episcopal edict throughout his diocese that as the priests from every parish, with cross and banners and relics of the saints, led the way, all who could go to war were to hasten to the nobles to defend the Church of Christ against the barbarians. As Australian scholar Elizabeth Freeman has said, the English went to war surrounded by the odor of sanctity. The Standard, by the way, is a ship's mast bearing at the top the banners of St. Peter, St. Wilfrid of Ripon, and St. John of Beverley, who had been an Archbishop of York. And it held at the top a pyx containing the consecrated host. This is the Church of Christ against the pagan Scots. There is no question about right and wrong in this. Walter Speck, who is the patron of Rievaulx, is pictured as the hero. He's absolutely the hero in Aelred's eyes, and he talks about him at great length, such great length that I can't share all of it with you, but some. Aelred says, Walter Speck was also there. He was an old man, full of years, of penetrating intelligence, prudent in counsel, forbearing in peacetime, and far-sighted in war, always maintaining friendship with allies and faith with kings. He was of great stature, and his limbs were not of excessive size, but suited to such a height. He had black hair, a full beard, an open and free forehead, large and piercing eyes, a very broad face of good proportion, and a voice like a trumpet, which brought a certain majesty of sound to his easy eloquence. He was, moreover, noble by birth, but nobler still in his Christian devotion. As he had no children as his heirs, though he had no lack of vigorous nephews, he made Christ the heir of all his best possessions. This is a remarkable passage. You really don't read this kind of description of a person in medieval works. Now he goes on to a digression that has caused a lot of scholarly attention. He brought to these regions the Cistercian order of whose fame England had scarcely heard, with the backing of the renowned King Henry receiving brothers from the very celebrated monastery of Clairvaux by the hand of Abbot Bernard, holy and beloved of God. The monks came to England in the year of the Lord's incarnation, 1132, and found a place in a deep valley along the bank of the River Rye, from which the monastery took its name, Rievaulx. By their reputation for holiness, they stirred up many to emulation of their loftiest endeavors, with the result that in a short time they increased beyond counting and founded many communities in both kingdoms, that is, of England and of Scotland. And he mentions fountains in here. Now, this is clearly unrelated to the Battle of the Standard. This is because he's telling us about Walter, and he thinks it would be good to throw this in as well. And we're glad he did. It's the best story we have about the founding of Rievaulx. Walter is cheering on. It's like a Shakespearean speech cheering on the forces. And he says, but it's more than that. It's Aelred's initial statement about the value of history. And Aelred, who has been reading the Venerable Bede all his life, I think understands himself as a historian, as someone who is devoted to the study of history. Walter says, "It is not unprofitable, my brave men, for you young men to listen to an old man. Instructed by the changes of many seasons, the succession of kings, and the diverse outcomes of wars, I tell you that I have also learned to ponder the past, to weigh the present, and to conjecture from the past to the present and from the present to the future. Certainly, if all who are listening to me savor, understand, and foresee before them what is coming our way today, I will willingly be silent and rest in sleep, or throw dice, or play chess. Or, if these things are not altogether appropriate to my years, I will give myself to the work of reading of history, or, as is my custom, turn my ear more attentively to someone recounting the deeds of the ancients. But I see that many of you are wavering, uncertain of memory." He goes on, "But we are not undertaking an unjust war on behalf of our king, who has not invaded a kingdom not rightfully his, as his enemies falsely claim, but has accepted it as an offering. He whom the people sought, the clergy chose, the Pope anointed, and apostolic authority confirmed in his kingdom." This passage comes directly from Stephen's coronation charter. So Aelred, in the voice of Walter a Speck, makes a claim which comes directly from Stephen himself. And the line, "who has not invaded a kingdom not rightfully his," well, in a later work, Aelred actually says directly, Stephen usurped the kingdom. So at this point, we see Aelred as absolutely supporting King Stephen and willing to write on behalf of those who are fighting for him. And Walter goes on saying, "Think about how great your glory will be when you fight and win on behalf of your absent king." So Walter takes up a big bunch of space as we hear about him and his speeches to the English soldiers. Meanwhile, Robert de Bruce, an old friend of King David, has gone to him across the lines and has said, "Don't do this. You've been a supporter. The Normans have supported you. They helped you get your kingdom when you were under attack. They are your relatives. Why would you do this? Don't do this." And David is actually close to agreeing to him. Meanwhile, the forces are assembling, and Prince Henry is described to us. Prince Henry, Aelred's young friend. The king's son and the knights and archers with him formed a second line with great shrewdness, and the men of Cumbria and Teviotdale joined them. He was a young man, fair of face and handsome in appearance, of such humility that he seemed lower than everyone, of such authority that he was revered by everyone, and so gentle, so pleasant, and so agreeable that he was loved by everyone. He was so chaste in body, so sober in speech, so honorable in all his ways, so diligent in church, and so attentive in prayer, so kind to the poor, and so resolute against malefactors, so respectful toward priests and monks, that he appeared to be a monk and a king and a monk. Notice, by the way, how Aelred loves these long strings of epithets. I mean, the rhetoric of these are quite wonderful. So, they're getting ready to fight, and there are the people who are the real villains in this piece are the men from Galway, the Galwegians. Now, these are men who were fierce fighters, and were often used as mercenaries in Scotland on behalf of the king. They tended to fight they always fought not with weapons. They wore kind of shaggy clothes, and they apparently mostly defeated their enemies by shouting at them. They rushed at them, they were bearded, they had shaggy cloaks, and they rushed, and they won the day. So the Galwegians are saying, let us go first. We have never been cowards. We have never backed down from a battle. That last battle you had, we won. Let us go first. And the knights are saying, no, let's let us go first with our swords and things, and the Galwegians could come later. This is, among other things, a conflict that's going on right now, that is right now in the 12th century, about the most efficient ways of fighting. Do you fight with swords? Do you fight on horses? How do you fight? And the Galwegians are arguing for a kind of old-fashioned way, and also, the bad Galwegians. There's a lot of stuff in this work in which Aelred allows people to attack the Galwegians. And I'm not sharing any of that because you can do it for yourself. Scottish historians, by the way, all of us love Aelred, who's gentle and peaceful and good. Scottish historians do not like Aelred because of the way he treated the Galwegians in this. So if you read Scottish history, you'll read bad things about Aelred. So the Galwegians are fighting to go first. Some of the knights are saying, no, let me go first. Other people are saying to David, don't do this. It's such a bad idea. David is almost to yield when William Fitz-Duncan, who shows up. And Aelred says, William, the king's nephew, a strong-minded man and the principal instigator of the war, so an insight we haven't had before, came up. In a great rage, he turned the king against his decision. So, King David is talked down by his nephew and goes ahead and attacks England unprovoked. And he goes on with the war despite good argument against it, and he allows the Galwegians to lead the battle. So, they go forth into battle. The Galwegians run toward the army, and they get pushed back. So, here's Aelred's description of this. The wedge of the Galwegians, shouting harshly 3 times according to their custom, rushed on the Southerners with such force that they drove the first lancers back from their position. But repulsed in their turn by the strength of the soldiers, they then received the courage and power of their foe. You might see a Galwegian stuck all around by arrows like the spines of a hedgehog, but shaking his sword nonetheless, now rushing forward to slaughter the enemy as if in blind madness, now beating the empty air with futile blows. At last, though, completely terrified, they melted away in flight, first killing their 2 leaders, Wigric and Donald. So, they have shown themselves cowards. They have turned into wounded animals. They have turned on their own leaders, and they flee, leaving the Scottish army in disarray behind them. This is the closest we get, in a way, to understanding how this battle ended. The end of the work, in the 12th century manuscript of this work, there are 3 manuscripts, but this is the original one. The end of the work reads this way. Meanwhile, that ornament of youths, glory of soldiers and delight of old men, the king's son, looked back, and saw that he had been left with only a few followers in the midst of the enemy. Turning to one of his companions and smiling, he said, "We have done what we could. Surely we have conquered as best we can. Now we need strategy no less than courage. There is no greater mark of constancy of mind than not to be broken in ill fortune." And, Aelred goes on, "that you may know how fearless he was in adversity and how far-sighted, while the other soldiers were casting the burden of their arms here, there, this best of youths bore his patiently. At last, coming to the hut of a certain pauper, he called out to the poor little man and took off his breastplate. Throwing it at the man's feet, he said, 'Take this, my man. It is a burden to me. May it serve you in your need.'" A lovely ending. Now, I said I would come back to the question of why Aelred wrote this work. It seems to me there are three possibilities. One is he wants to work through his own feelings about all of this. Time has passed, and so many of the participants have died. He's writing in 1153. Prince Henry died in June 1152. King David died in May 1153. Walter Speck dies sometime in 1153. So perhaps it's a memorial to these figures, all of whom he loved. Elizabeth Freeman, whom I mentioned before, says that he writes to create community memory of Walter and memory of the founding of Rievaulx. I think there's also a piece of it that other people have written about the battle blaming David. David is roundly criticized by other people writing about this battle. Maybe Aelred is wanting just a little bit to improve David's reputation. He doesn't think he did a good thing, but maybe he thinks he can counter some of the people who are complaining about David. We don't know. We don't know why he wrote it, and we don't know why it took him so many years to get around to writing it. What we know is that it is, as I say, a sort of clutter of ideas, a sort of mishmash of topics. And it's hard to even say that I would want to recommend it as a work to read. It's such a jumble that you might not want to. On the other hand, as I was thinking about it today, I thought, this work is just terrific. It's full of so much good stuff. And if you think about this young man who is now writing this first piece of history as the first work he has done without guidance, without instruction, without even a good editor, then we have to marvel at it because he has left us a lot of pieces of stuff that make it worth reading and worth thinking about it. So I recommend it to you on those grounds.